Hi, kids. Hope you're all doing well. This is the College Bible Study lesson for May the 3rd. You can see here that we're in Luke 5 today, verses 3 to 32. And then next week we'll be in Mark 1 and 2. These are parallel passages in these two places. Excuse me. And so I'm going to take this, the two stories I'm going to talk about this week, the 3 verses in Luke 5 that talk about cleansing of the leper. And then next week, I'm talking about the paralyzed man, the one where they dug the roof out and lowered him down to Jesus. So that's what we're going to do. So this one's all about the leper. So 3 different places we're going to talk about this leper stuff. One, we're going to connect the leper stuff to the grand story. Genesis, the flood, it's connected somehow. And so I don't really know what all that means, but it's connected. I don't have any doubt about that. So we're going to look just very briefly, since we're not going to do it next week, very briefly in Matthew, because evidently the cleansing of this leper thing is a big deal. And so Matthew brings it up, really important spots. Luke, really important spot. Mark, really important spot. So I think something's supposed to be resonating about this leprosy stuff. And then we're just going to review, there's 5 stories, just very briefly, people in the Old Testament who had leprosy, to see if that's supposed to inform the way we read what Jesus did here. And then the last part will be the part where we just go, I'm just going to talk about it and read verses and stuff. Then I'm just going to go, something, there's Jesus. I think, so the conclusion will be that Jesus is everything. That'll be the conclusion. So I'm sure, I mean, for me, talking about this cleansing and holiness stuff and all that with the leprosy, it really feeds into what we've been talking about already with Nicodemus and baptism and the sprinkling of the water and all of that. It's all tied together somehow. It's things that make you, Christy and I go on these long walks, things that make you go, I think I need to think about that some more. So that's the plan. 3-minute overview there. Okay, so first of all, here's the thing. On the second slide there, you can see this science journal called Clinics in Dermatology back in 2016 published, they dedicated the whole journal. It's like over 100-page journal, and all of the peer-reviewed research articles were on leprosy. Excuse me. You can see the title just barely here, Leprosy in the Bible, in the second one. And so I copied a little bit of the abstract here. I think it's helpful. These guys obviously did all kinds of science stuff, and I read bits of it, but I didn't read the whole thing. But anyway, they say in the abstract, for many years, the biblical term, it's the Hebrew word, sa'arat, for leprosy. I put a bunch of slides in my original presentation to track all the usages of that word in the Old Testament. And then the one that's used in the New Testament, I thought, I read them. Okay, we're not doing that. So I cut all those out of the presentation. Next paragraph says, although the real nature of this leprosy is unknown, the differential diagnosis might include the following. You see the list? Psoriasis, dermatitis, infections, other types of dermatitis, scabies, syphilis, impetigo, alopecia, all kinds of skin diseases. And so these guys are publishing. And so evidently, when we read the phrase, we read leprosy, there is leprosy in our world. Like, I think I read that over half the cases, new cases every year in India, it's caused, there's a couple of versions of it. There's a short and a long-term version. It's caused by a bacteria. It's actually a bacterial infection. It is treatable. It is curable today. But anyway, whatever you want to make of that, leprosy. Probably in the Bible, it meant a skin problem. Mm-hmm. It could have been leprosy, but the term we have in our minds is leprosy, and the term used in the Bible, I think the term in the Bible, from what I've read, is a more general skin condition. Okay, so that's just background. So first of all, connect this with Noah's flood. So again, I had another slide connecting all the Adam and Eve stuff to all the Noah stuff. We don't need to waste time with that. One verse will do, or two verses. Genesis 1, God speaking to Adam and Eve, it says, he blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish, the birds, every living thing. The flood comes. Noah, God speaks to Noah and his sons in chapter 9 after the flood. He says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear or terror of you will be on the beasts and the birds and everything that creeps on and all the fish. And so there's your list again of the things. And so I know there's been a lot of people have said a lot about this, and there's no doubt the Adam and Eve story and the Noah story and the flood story are all interconnected. No doubt about that. The language all over the place. Noah sins in a garden. There's just all kinds of connections. So there's a retelling of the story of humanity here. Adam and Eve are created. Noah comes on the scene. He's the 10th in the line, and God then destroys all the evil in the flood. The waters of the flood destroy all the evil as a reboot. And then Noah's making a sacrifice in chapter 8 at the end of that. Cain and Abel are bringing their sacrifices. The connections are all over the place. Okay, so what I want to do is John Sailhammer's commentary, the Pentateuch Is Narrative, had a table with, I forget how many there were now. There's like 20 or 30 of these. I just picked out a couple to make the point. So in Genesis 6, the waters of the flood cover all the corrupt flesh. In the leper story, there's water mentioned in cleansing there in Leviticus chapter 14 7 times. I'm at a point now in my life where when you see something like that, you go, okay, well, that's not an accident. The ark is plastered with pitch. The leper's house is plastered with clay. Noah waits 7 days at the door of the ark before he goes in. The leper, with the leper story in Leviticus 14, the priest waits 7 days at the door of the leper's house in the cleansing process. At the end of the thing, there's a sacrifice of a clean animal. It's interesting. The clean animal stuff there in Genesis, as God makes sure to tell Noah, make sure you bring a clean animal. There is no regulation on clean animals yet. And then he has to sacrifice a clean animal at the end in Genesis 8. And then there's a sacrifice. In fact, Jesus, in the story in Luke, whenever he says, Jesus, after the leper's cleansed, he says, go show the priest, make the sacrifice. So he's getting this from Leviticus story. And so this is one of those things that's worthy of pondering. In what way does the author of the Torah want us connecting the creation story, the flood story, and the story of the lepers? They're connected. So maybe we'll return to that at the end. We'll just let that sit for the time being. But I have no doubt that these stories, the grand story of the universe, how about if I say it that way? the whole story of who we are, the creation of man, and God's dealings with mankind are somehow tied up in this little 2-verse story where Jesus cleanses the leper. Of that, I'm convinced. Okay, so in Matthew, I'm on slide 5, Chris. In Matthew, we did this before where I showed you the bookmarks in Matthew. So in Matthew 4, it says Jesus was going about teaching and proclaiming the gospel and healing every kind of disease and sickness. And then you have the Sermon on the Mount there, chapters 5 to 7. And then in Matthew 8 to 9, he's doing the healing of every kind of sickness and disease. So Matthew set this up this way. He's saying, here you go. This is what Jesus is doing. I'm going to give you examples, and then I'll close it in Matthew 9. And look at the first healing he does is of a leper. Interesting. Why is Matthew making that issue? So just let that sit for just a minute. In Matthew 10, in the very next chapter, as he begins, he names the disciples. So he names the 12 disciples, and then he says, you're going to go out. He says here, Jesus summoned the 12, and he gives them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and heal every kind of disease. So this is like, okay, I've shown you the kingdom. He's taught the Sermon on the Mount. He's healing every kind of diseases. Now, your turn. So the 12, the nation, is going out now. And look, this is what you do. As you go, preach, saying, number 1, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Here's what you do. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out the demons. There you go. Cleansing lepers. Okay, but I'm not done. Matthew then in chapter 11, there's this odd little story in Matthew 11 where John the Baptist has been put in prison, and at this point, he's having some doubts. So it says here that John sent word by his disciples to Jesus, and he says, are you the expected one, or should we look for somebody else? So Jesus answers and says to him, go report to John what you hear and see. He says, verse 5, the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them. Now, these, the blind and the lame and the deaf, and even the poor having the gospel preached to them, this is coming up in Luke chapter, in 2 weeks. In Luke, we're going to spend a lot of time with this gospel being preached to the poor. But here's the point here. This is most certainly Jesus pulling on the prophecies of Isaiah for John's disciples and John to hear. He's telling John, I'm the one. So this is it's like 5 or 6 different places in Isaiah where this language is used. I've got one of them out of Isaiah 35 here. The blind, the eyes of the blind are open, the ears of the deaf are unstopped, the lame leap like a deer. This is in the chapter about all this new creation, great kingdom of God coming stuff in Isaiah. So there's no doubt that Jesus is saying to John, I am Isaiah's messianic figure. Tell John what you've seen. The blind have received their sight, and the lame are walking, and the dead are raised, and the deaf hear. This is coming straight out of Isaiah, but the lepers part. So I went to Bible Gateway, and I typed in leper and leprous and leprosy, looking for these words in Isaiah. 0. Not mentioned. So it's a reasonable question. Why? Why the lepers being cleansed? Why is that part of the list that Jesus uses to convince John that he is the messianic figure from Isaiah? Okay, so we'll let that sit, just making the point that it's important. Okay, to Luke now for today's lesson. So we've done some of Luke already. This is slide 7. So before, as we're going through Luke, we talked about how Luke is presenting Jesus. And he's got the baptism story, and he's got the Holy Spirit coming on Jesus, and he's got the pronouncement, "You are my beloved Son." So we talked about that a lot. The Spirit of God and him being God's Son. Remember, 2 of the 3 temptations starts off, "If you are the Son of God." And so that's a very important thing. So Luke proves it with his genealogy. So right after "You are my beloved Son," Luke puts the genealogy, and he goes from Joseph all the way to God. Then he's got Jesus full of the Spirit going out, and he's tempted. Then we go through the 3 temptations. Okay, at the end of chapter 4 now, this is leading into today's lesson. We haven't done this before. It's got this thing where Jesus goes into the synagogue, and they hand him the scroll of Isaiah, and he rolls it out, and he reads from it. That's 2 weeks from now. I've been so excited about doing it now for 3 weeks. We still got 2 more weeks before we get to it. But this is the one where he quotes out of Isaiah 61, and then he mixes a couple of other quotations out of Isaiah in there. And it's like, then he sits down, he doesn't say anything, and everybody's just... And then there's a weird verse. It says, right after that, they were all amazed at the eloquence of his words. But they asked this question. Here it is in verse 22. "Isn't this Joseph's boy?" And so Jesus' response to that, he says, a prophet's not honored in his own country. But here's what he says. "There were many widows in the days of Elijah. Elijah didn't go to any of them, but only to the one at Zarephath in the land of Sidon." Y'all, I'm going to highlight it here. Krista can't see that. Sidon. That's Gentile country, Sidon. "And there were many, there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian." So we're going to talk about that story in just a minute. So he's already introduced this back into our heads. What's Luke thinking about? We got clues here, what he's thinking about as he's writing. But this has a bizarre effect. The people were filled with rage. They rush on him like they're going to kill him. And then there's this verse that says, "And he slipped out and disappeared, from their presence." So why do you think they were so mad? I mean, he's talking about here stuff that makes them very angry. Jesus is going to do this in his ministry. He's going to make these people angry all the time by approaching those that he's not supposed to be approaching. We don't like Gentiles, and we don't touch lepers. And so let me see if I get this straight. God is after these people. Evidently, that's the way they're hearing what he's saying, because they are not happy about it. Okay, so that's introduced there early, there in chapter, for the lesson today. And then after that, he goes into the synagogue, and there's a man there with an unclean. Talk about this clean and cleansing stuff all over again. He's possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon. And then Jesus cast him out. And it's interesting because I've got it in bold under verse 41. When he does this with these demons, they know who he is. He's like, "We know who you are. You're the Son of God." And Jesus is like, you get out of this person and you shut up. No talking. And the demons obey him when that happens. He also heals Peter's mother-in-law here at the end. And then chapter 5 starts with the story about how Jesus gets on the boat with Peter. And he says, cast the nets on the other side of the boat. And Peter says, we've been fishing all night. And Jesus says, do it. And so they do. And then they fill up his boat. And then evidently the sons of Zebedee, James and John, are with him. And they fill up both boats to the point they're sinking. And Jesus finishes that with, I'm going to make you fishers of men. That's the way that finishes. All right, so that brings us to today's lesson, which is this story of the leper. Very short story. Luke chapter 5, verse 12. While he was in one of the cities, behold, there was a man covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, I think it's important to notice how he worded this. So, number one, the man has no doubt that Jesus can heal him. Okay, so that's number one. So he's got faith, which is going to be part of the next story about the paralytic. It starts off by Jesus saying, I see your faith. So Lord, if you're willing, so he knows he can. But he doesn't say, would you heal me? He says, would you make me clean? So if you know about the story of leprosy and how these people were treated, we're going to read a couple of these verses here in just a minute. This is a very rich, very informative little statement here. Make me clean. So what would it mean to be clean? Why would he want to be clean? Okay, so a bunch of reasons. Number one, if he's got leprosy, a skin condition, then he hasn't had any human contact. He's likely having to live somewhere away from the city. The terminology that I'm going to finish the lesson with today is they're put outside the camp. That's where the lepers are. They're outside the camp. There's nothing in the Leviticus part about how you get the leper better. But if the leper gets better, there is a mechanism by which they can be brought back into the community. But he's not clean. And clean means something else. It's not just that he's outside the camp, that he's diseased or whatever. It means something else. To be unclean means you don't get to go to the temple and participate.
So you're cut off from the ability to worship.
You're cut off from your ability to worship the God that you serve, the God that you love, the God that you given your life to. You cannot be in the place where he wants you to be, worshiping the way he wants you to worship. So I'm sure he wants to be healed of his skin condition, but his wording here means something. He wants to be made clean. So that's important. It says then, he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him, and then watch this. Jesus then orders him, he says, don't tell anybody. This is something common. He's telling the demons, don't tell anybody. He's telling this guy, don't tell anybody. He's telling the disciples all the time, don't tell anybody. So I think there's multiple reasons for that. Probably the big one is it's not yet time for him to be tried and crucified. Because when everybody knows, the whole thing's going to go down. But also because they don't understand what's going on. So keep your mouth shut if you don't understand. So Don't tell anybody. Then go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing. So that's straight up right out of Leviticus. In fact, I've got it shown here in the box. There's 2 chapters in particular in Leviticus, 116 verses, that are worthy of some time pondering. We're not going to do that. It's just a lot of reading and thinking about, and the skin's there, and it formed a scab, but it's not a scab, and if there's goo flowing out of it, what do you do, and how many days, and then how many times you got to go see the priest, and the priest waits, and it's just all this stipulation about how to deal with the leper. 2 whole chapters in Leviticus. All right. So with that as the backdrop for leprosy, what I want to do first is just briefly talk about the 5 major stories where there's lepers first. And then I want to finish with what Leviticus seems to be saying about these lepers and their cleansing and this idea of them being outside the camp. So I'm going to tell you where this is going. Christy knows already because we talked about this earlier on our walks. I'm headed for Hebrews chapter 13 and how the author of Hebrews reads going outside the camp. That's where this is headed. All right, so there's a story when Moses in Exodus chapter 4 where Moses says, they're not going to listen to me, and so prove it to me. And so there's a couple of things going on here. He does one with the snake and one with leprosy. And so God tells him to put his hand inside his bosom, put it in, take it out. It's covered with lepers. Did it again. It's clean. And so leprosy, the skin thing, is a way that it's a thing that God gives Moses to prove that he is the one. Which is interesting because in Numbers chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron have this issue with Moses over his marriage with a Cushite woman, and then this makes God none too happy. And so Miriam ends up with leprosy, and then Moses has to intercede for her. So in both cases, Exodus 4 and Numbers 12, Moses is vindicated or highlighted as the leader in both cases. So leprosy seems to be highlighting Moses as the true prophet. Interesting. In the storyline. The language is used here. You see I've got it underlined. That comes from Leviticus. She used to be shut up for 7 days outside the camp. There it is. Outside the camp. That's where she goes with the leprosy. Following the guidelines. In some sense, if you have not read Leviticus about all the guidelines for leprosy, this idea about Miriam being shut up outside the camp for 7 days, you're going, what's that for? But it makes perfect sense if you know the guidelines from Leviticus as to what they're to do with her. Okay, and then there's the story that Jesus quotes, the Naaman story. This is a Gentile, and he wants to be healed, and you know the story. Elisha heals him, but he doesn't want to go to the Jordan. He wants to go up to one of his pretty rivers, and he goes and he washes 7 times. Again, okay, there you go. And then after he's healed, after Naaman's healed, his servant, because when Naaman came, he was like the commander. He's the captain of the army. He brings all this gold and silver and changes of clothes, and he brings that to Elisha. Elisha won't take any of it. But Elisha's servant, the guy who helps him out, Gehazi, sees all the stuff and he wants some. So he chases Naaman down and he says, I'll take some of that. And so he takes some and he goes and hides it, and he gets back to Elisha, and Elisha says, dude, I was there watching you when you got the stuff. And then the leprosy, then Elisha says, now you're going to have it and all your descendants. So that's 3, 2 more. 2 Kings chapter 6. I'm just getting my head wrapped around the story again. I'm trying to, oh yeah. So in 2 Kings 6, it came about after this. It says, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, gathered his army, besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria. And then right after that, there's that story about, there's a story right after that about the two women. And the one woman says, they're under siege and there's a great famine, so they got nothing to eat. So the two ladies talk, and the one says, let's eat your son today and tomorrow we'll eat my son. And then she goes back on her word, and then it's so bad. It's so bad. And then Elisha comes on the scene. He says, food's going to be cheap by this time tomorrow. And they all say, no way that's going to happen in one day. And then there's this miraculous thing where God runs the army out, and they think, the army thinks they hear chariots and stuff. And what happens is they leave all their stuff, all their gold and their silver and their clothes and their food. It's like the images of all this bounty out there with nobody. And guess who discovers it? 4 leprous men, it says, discover the bounty. And the leprous men then become the saviors of the nation because they come back in. They get out there and they say, should we keep all this for ourselves? No, we better tell somebody. They're outside the camp. They're the first to discover. So they come back in, they tell everybody, and it's okay, so leprosy. And then the last one, maybe the most famous one, is the Uzziah story told in Kings and Chronicles. But in Chronicles it says, all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. Okay, then I skip a big part. He was a good guy at first, like a lot of the Judean kings, turned bad. And then in verse 16 it says, when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly. He was unfaithful to the Lord. And this is what he did. He entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar. That was a no-no. And the priest correct him, and he's belligerent about it. And then it says in verse 21, King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He lived in a separate house, being a leper. He was cut off from the house of the Lord. Then verse 22 says, now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first to the last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, has written. So there's a tie here from Uzziah becoming a leper to the way Isaiah is actually called into the ministry. So all this language about leprosy is outside the camp. Special cleansing. You don't go into the presence of the Lord without cleansing. And I'm going to read a couple of these verses. I got one out of Leviticus 10 for Aaron's son so that you can see it, because it's dramatic in places all over the Torah. You don't go into God's presence. He's holy. And so with that as the backdrop, then look at Isaiah's call in Isaiah chapter 6. And this will have significance in the last slide here, which I'm only 3 slides away. Isaiah chapter 6 says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. So he's evidently, as a prophet here, he's in the temple. He sees the Lord. So just reading this, Chrissy said, yeah, but it was a vision. And I said, yeah, it was a vision. I think, yeah, it was a vision. But it's significant what happens here in his call, I think. Seraphim, that's a fun one to talk about, stood above him, each having 6 wings, 2 over the face, 2 over the feet, 2 he flies. One called out to another. There's more than one of them. And here's what they're saying. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And that resonates with the reader of the Bible. This, I think, would have resonated with the leper. The Lord is holy. You don't go in his presence unclean. To be unclean would not necessarily have meant that he had done something wrong. So I'm going to talk about that some more next week with Jesus says your sins are forgiven to the paralytic. But in the Old Testament, to be unclean is not always connected to somebody doing something wrong. It just means in this condition, and I'm going to read them here in just a second out of Numbers chapter 5. You don't eat anything unclean. You don't touch a dead body. You don't come in contact with any kind of discharge, sexual discharge, and you don't have leprosy. You don't have a skin thing going on. These are things that make you unclean. And so when you're unclean, you're not in the presence of God. But also, as next week will be the big emphasis, being unclean is also so being unclean is you're not in the presence of God. He's holy. He's
Well, it just made me think too of how animals are clean and unclean, and animals don't have choices of good and bad in a sense either. So the way humans can be unclean, it's just a condition of the fallen world.
So that's first step. Mm-hmm. And the second step that Luke makes is the forgiveness of sin in the story of the paralytic. So the uncleanness keeps them away from the Lord. And the sin keeps them away from the presence of God. And they're both, both of those are here in Isaiah 6. So he says, woe is me. That's dramatic. By saying I am ruined, it means what he thinks is he's a dead man. Yeah, he's done for. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So he's assuming this is the end of his life. And then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he'd taken from the altar with tongs. And he touched my mouth with the burning thing. He says, behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away and your sin is forgiven. So I think this is a monumental moment in the Old Testament where the holiness of God comes in contact with the uncleanness and the sinfulness of man. And God moves with cleansing fire and takes the iniquity away, moves toward the man. Okay, so go ahead, Chris. You got something on your head here.
Question. What's the difference in iniquity and sin?
Oh, yeah. So I don't remember.
Okay.
There is a difference. You're right.
But there's an and, so that makes me think it's two separate concepts.
Yeah. Let me just look that up right quick. So this is Isaiah 6, 7. All right. So iniquity aon is a misdeed or sin, guilt caused by sin or punishment. And then let's see what the other one is. I've heard somebody talk about this before, I think. Maybe Bart talked about it one time. The other one is hatat, which is an act or feeling that transgresses something forbidden or ignores something required by God's law. And the other one is the state of having committed an offense. That's the sense of it. So the first one is having committed an offense, and the second one is an act or feeling that transgresses something forbidden or ignores something required by God's law or character, whether in thought, feeling, speech, or action. So nuances of the same thing, but I know there's more to that, and I don't remember. Okay, so here's where we're going to finish. This is the stuff out of Leviticus about God's holiness and being clean and separating them and putting them outside the camp and stuff. So I want to spend like 10 or 15 minutes thinking about these last 3 slides with you, like we were talking about. So first of all, there's a real important moment in Leviticus in chapter 10 where Aaron's sons do something that's not real clear what they did. Maybe they were drunk, that's the indication, but they did something with their fire pans, and they're sons of Aaron, so you assume they have the right to be working as the priests. But here it says, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. So God kills the 2 of them. And then Moses says to Aaron, Aaron, this is what God said. By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. So I think this is the kind of story that would really resonate in the mind of a leper. God is holy. I cannot be in his presence. It could cost me my life. That kind of story. In Leviticus 11, the wording about the leper, the more wording about the holiness. In Leviticus 11, it says, "For I am the Lord your God." Consecrate, that word consecrate, has got the same letters in it as holy. So you could say, "I'm the Lord your God, holy yourselves." Set apart yourselves, yeah. "Therefore, and be holy, for I am holy." Holiness, the holiness of God, I think, you tell me what you think, Chris. I think that the first thing that comes to the mind when I say holiness is being like a really good person. Or it could be said sarcastically, like, "Oh, well, there he's holier than thou. He thinks he's so holy." That's not really the meaning of the word in the Bible. So in the Bible, to be holy, here's a good illustration that I heard Tim use. He said, it's like the surgery room in the hospital. It's the clean room. Only somebody who's dressed properly and who's been cleaned can go in there. You know where this room is, and you know you don't go in there. The only way you can go in there is if there's been some special things done to you. So that's really a better sense about what holy means in terms of who God is. His presence is something special. Help me. To be set apart. He's different.
I've heard illustrations like the sun, like we get the sun for our trees and we can live in it, but yet if we would get in a spaceship and go too close to it,
it's holy.
It would consume us.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. Okay, so with that backdrop, he says, "You be holy, for I am holy." He says, "You will not make yourselves unclean." And this is in the part right after all the rules about what they're supposed to eat, the unclean food stuff, which is interesting. Just tuck in the back of your head here for just a second. You know, there's a vision that Peter has about eating unclean food. So something we should process here, I think. He says, you be holy because I'm holy. And so remember, keep that Isaiah thing in the back of your head here. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. This is what the seraphim are saying. And so God's saying, you be holy because I'm holy. You be different. Then in Leviticus 13, here we go with the leprosy stuff. So 2 more slides and we're done. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. The show that we were watching, The Chosen. It's a great scene where the leper walks up to Jesus, and the disciples are there, and they're all freaking out, and he hollers out. His clothes are all torn, and and he screams out, unclean, unclean. According to this thing in Leviticus 13, it says, he shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. And he shall live alone. His dwelling will be outside the camp. So this is what's required of him. So this is where the leper is living when he comes to Jesus. He's coming from outside the camp. He's heard that he can be made clean, so that he can
be restored to community and
back into the community, back into
worship.
Back into the worship. Yeah,
Restoration. It's
restoration. Yeah. Okay, so Numbers 5 says, these are the ones who are unclean. He says, Numbers 5:1, command the sons of Israel that they send away from the camp every leper, so that's first on the list, everyone with a discharge, and everyone who is unclean because of a dead person. So these are the unclean people. Notice how it's all related to life fluids. So the image, I think, is the scab is broken and the blood is leaking out. There's life in the blood. Life is leaking out. You're unclean. The fluids, the sexual discharge, these are the fluids of life. So saliva doesn't make babies, but semen does. So you're unclean. It's life fluids. A dead person, you don't touch the dead person.
The life is gone.
The life is gone. Yeah. So the imagery there is a death image, really. The uncleanness, being a dead man, which is one way you might say the leper felt like he was a dead man living outside the
It
camp.
makes me think of Tamar and Judah, whenever the sons of Judah,
And Onan.
they were killed instantly because they didn't get Tamar pregnant.
Yeah, I think it was was. It says he was. He didn't. He wasted his seed on the ground, I think is what it
And
says
he was
there.
killed.
Yeah, God killed him. Yeah. Okay, so it says then in verse 3, you will send away both male and female. You will send them outside the camp so that they will not defile their camp where I dwell in their midst. So once again, it's the image of the place where God is a holy place, and you can't be there if you're unclean. So let's think about that for just a second. The place where God is, being in the presence of God. Isaiah finds himself there. And he knows he's unclean. He thinks he's dead. And in the image of Isaiah's call, the Lord, via the seraphim, move in and cleanse him so that he doesn't die in the presence of God. I wonder if the leper showing up in the presence of Jesus, if Luke doesn't have this in mind, now Jesus is in that place, moving toward the leper to make him clean. It resonates with me thinking about the Old Testament stories of cleanness and moving into the presence of God. It seems like to me that Luke is saying here in the healing story of the leper, Jesus is in fact God. The leper is in the presence of God, which is exactly what happens in the next story. He says, your sins are forgiven. There's only one person who can forgive sins. That's blasphemy, according to the Pharisees who are there. So I think it's the same thing being told in both cases. Okay, last two here. So outside the camp and the tent of meeting. So here's the context for the whole book of Leviticus. And this I have it up here in the right-hand corner if any of you are interested. I'm getting a copy. The Pentateuch Is Narrative. It's a commentary on Genesis to Deuteronomy. So at the end of the book of Exodus, in chapter 40, there is, they finish building the tabernacle. Okay? So it's done. They finish building it. And in verse 17, it says, now in the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month. So the first month, second year, first day. Okay. So that's related to the time that they've come out of, that's from the Passover thing in Exodus chapter 12. So it's the second year now, first month, first day of the month. Tabernacle goes up. First month. This is all tied to their first month, which is the Passover. This will be the first of the month. This will be the first of the year for you. Okay. Then, that's the end of the book of Exodus. Then the book of Leviticus. And then the first verse of Numbers, chapter 1 says, the Lord says, in the tent of meeting, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting on the first. So notice, first of all, he's talking to Moses in the tent of meeting. See that? Up in the top right-hand corner. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent. God's talking to Moses in the tent. So that's going to be important. On the first of the second month in the second year. So where does the book of Leviticus fit then in the timeline?
A month of those two.
Yeah, it's almost like, here's the big picture. Leviticus is going to give you all of the regulations for how Moses gets to hear from God inside the tabernacle. Because at the end of the book, end of Exodus, the tabernacle goes up and it says they can't go in there. The glory of God fills the place and they can't go in. So now you get all this Leviticus sacrificial system, the leper story, all the cleanness and uncleanness and all those laws. And then there's a month of Leviticus, and then Moses gets to go in. First verse. That's the way it's all set up. So here's how Sailhammer said it, and this will lead to the last slide. The narrative framework of Leviticus shows that these instructions were given to Moses by the Lord at the tent of meeting. This was probably, so this is in Leviticus, all right? This was probably the tent Moses set up outside the camp where God spoke to him. So the question here is it the tent of meeting here in Numbers 1 or the tent of meeting in Exodus 33? Okay, so follow it. According to Exodus 40, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting. Thus, God continued to speak with Moses from the tent outside the camp. We can already see in the strategy of the writer the importance of the offerings and sacrifices and the dedication of the priesthood. Only after the dedication of the tabernacle and the priesthood were Moses and Aaron able to enter the tent where God's glory dwelt. Moses received the instructions for the offerings and the sacrifices from the tent of meeting outside the camp, but their purpose was to make the other tent of meeting, the tabernacle, accessible. Did you get it? You see it?
He was the middleman to help make it happen.
Yes. Yeah. So the whole point of the story of the cleanness and uncleanness, it appears, like in Peter's case and others, they had misinterpreted that whole thing. The whole point of the story is to help you understand how you can get into the presence of God. That's the overarching story. Is it Moses as the mediator? Here it is. Moses as the mediator gets the instructions outside the camp so that he and the people can get inside the tent.
It adds another layer of meaning to a prophet like Moses.
It has another layer of meaning, yeah. And I'm wondering if that's not also processing here with Jesus is approaching this leper. The image really there of the leper is he is unclean in the presence of the Lord. And God cleanses him and lets him into the temple. Like you said yesterday when we were walking, John presents Jesus as having tabernacled with us. His body is the temple. He's in the presence of the Lord. I think that's the leper story. He's come in unclean into the presence of the Lord. And the Lord then, in the Isaiah thing, the coal goes over and cleanses him. And Jesus reaches over and touches the leper and cleanses him. Okay, so here's the last one. I typed into Bible Gateway this phenomenon of being outside the camp. There's 31 of them. And so I went through and organized them on my sheet here. And so that's fun. They fit in about 3 or 4 different categories being outside the camp. And so I'm not going to go through all that. But it's cool just to explore in the Old Testament what it meant to be outside the camp. That's where the lepers were. They're outside the camp. Okay, but here's the last part. And I think it's tied together. This is in Hebrews chapter 13. Verse 10, it says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat." Who's serving the tabernacle? That's the priesthood. What altar is he talking about? "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp." Now that's one of the major categories. So this idea of burning the sacrifice of the sin offering happens in Exodus 29, Leviticus 4, Leviticus 8, Leviticus 9, Leviticus 16, Leviticus 17. So this is a common, here's a sampling right here. You can see all these places in Leviticus where he's getting this from. They're burned outside the camp. Now watch how he turns this. This is so cool. "Therefore, Jesus also, that he might," there's the word, "make holy," sanctify, "that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate." So just so you know I'm not confused. "So," he says, "let us go out to him outside the camp." There it is. Bearing his reproach. For here we do not have a lasting city. So he's referring to Jerusalem and the temple and the crucifixion. We are seeking the city which is to come, the new creation, the new Jerusalem. So the Hebrew writer has now put Jesus outside the camp, which is really interesting because Jesus goes into Jerusalem at Passover. So the typical forgiveness of sin technique was they go to the temple, they take the lamb, the bull, whatever, they cut the throat, the bull's on the altar and everything. Then that's the forgiveness of sin. But where do they crucify Jesus? Outside the city. So the Hebrew author is saying, that's where we go, outside the camp. Let's go out to him outside the camp. The better sacrifice, the better promise in the book of Hebrews, Jesus outside the camp. I have lots to think about more here. Chris? We've talked about it a couple times, and it's just all circulating in my head. I'm convinced of this, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all highlight the leper. The lepers were outside the camp. The initial impression is, I don't eat food like that. I don't associate with people like that. That is all outside the camp. That's the initial impression. But even the Old Testament narrative seems to be saying something richer than that. It seems to be saying that God is moving toward that uncleanness to fix it so that people can be in his presence. I know there's layers and layers that I'm missing, but I don't think that we're supposed to just brush through this thing that happened with the leper. He wanted to be cleansed to be in the presence of God. He's unclean. Isaiah ties the uncleanness with sin. And so the very next story is, Jesus says, just like Leviticus says, go and make your sacrifice in front of the priest. Don't tell anybody else, you tell them. And then the next story begins. The priests have gathered, the priests and the Pharisees have gathered from all over the country, from Galilee to Judea. They've gathered, and they're watching when they get that paralytic in there. And Jesus has got the priest, presumably they already know about the leper. And now the paralytic comes in and he goes, your sins are forgiven. He's got their attention.
Because only God can forgive sins, so he's saying he's God, and that's what sends him over.
That they understand exactly what he's saying.
I feel like I need to read through all of Hebrews again.
Me too. I did. My head just spins with all of it. But, yeah. So some of you have been sending me text messages and other things. Emma's dad sent a very helpful thing last week about, or was it 2 weeks ago? I've lost track of time. About Nicodemus. It's very helpful, so thanks a lot for that. So I'm happy for you guys to contribute by conversation. Help me. Emma's dad sent me all this stuff about the Jewish literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud, and how Nicodemus he should have most certainly known about being born from above. Jesus had every right to be frustrated with him as a teacher in Israel. So, anyway,
We miss you guys.
there you go. We miss y'all. Hope to see you soon.